You spend your weekends playing video games about cowboys, and now you think you're tough enough for the 1880s? Please. One ride on a wooden stagecoach would break your back, and the frontier diet would ruin your stomach. You belong exactly where you are, on a comfortable couch.
Welcome back. Forget everything you think you know about the Wild West. Those epic saloon brawls, the honorable quick-draw duels, the heroic cowboys. It's all a brilliantly crafted Hollywood lie. The actual frontier was a harsh, heavily regulated landscape where survival meant freezing in the mud, not riding off into the sunset. Today, we are destroying 30 of the biggest historical myths that completely fooled the world. Don't reach for your guns, just listen. Let's get started. Myth 1. The High Noon Duel. If you've ever watched a classic Western, you know the drill. Two rugged men step out onto a dusty, sun-baked street right at high noon. The town goes dead silent, tumbleweeds roll by, and they wait to see who draws their weapon first. It is the ultimate display of American honor and grit. There is just one tiny problem. It is completely, 100% made up. Real frontier outlaws did not care about honor. They cared about staying alive. If a gunslinger wanted you dead, he wasn't going to send you a polite invitation for a fair fight in the middle of town. He was going to hide in a dark alley behind a whiskey barrel and shoot you in the back with a double-barreled shotgun while you were walking to the outhouse. It wasn't glorious, but it was highly effective. Myth 2. Open carry everywhere. We all imagine frontier towns as chaotic free-for-alls, where every single person walking into the local saloon was packing heavy iron on their hip. It makes for great television, but the actual mayors of these towns completely disagreed. The most famous, violently notorious towns in the West, including Dodge City and Tombstone, actually enforced incredibly strict gun control laws. The moment you rode into town, you were legally required to surrender your revolvers to the local sheriff or leave them at a designated drop-off point. Business owners and Eastern investors hated random gunfire because it was terrible for commerce. If you walked down the main street openly carrying a loaded six-shooter, you weren't an American hero, you were going straight to a cold jail cell. Myth 3. Spectacular shootouts. Hollywood shootouts are epic, 10-minute acrobatic battles with pinpoint accuracy where the hero shoots the gun right out of the bad guy's hand. In reality, 19th century pistols were notoriously inaccurate, and the ammunition was incredibly primitive. More importantly, they used black powder. After the very first shot was fired, a thick, suffocating cloud of gray smoke would instantly fill the entire room or alleyway, making it physically impossible to see your target. Real shootouts weren't tactical masterpieces. They were chaotic, deafening moments of pure, blind panic fired at point-blank range. Men would empty their entire revolvers into the blinding smoke, entirely missing their targets, and then just awkwardly run away when they ran out of ammunition. Myth 4. The gun that won the West. You have probably heard the legendary phrase claiming that the Winchester rifle was the gun that won the West. It sounds like an undisputed historical fact, but it is actually just a brilliant piece of corporate marketing. That famous phrase was literally invented as an advertising slogan by the Winchester Company in 1914, long after the frontier had already closed. If you want to know the actual, most reliable weapon that protected stagecoaches and kept pioneers safe, look no further than the simple, brutal, double-barreled shotgun. It was cheap, it didn't require sniper-level aiming while bouncing on a wagon, and it was devastatingly effective at close range. That is exactly where we get the modern phrase, riding shotgun, when calling the passenger seat of a car. Myth 5. Daily bank robberies. Western movies make it seem like robbing a bank was a standard Tuesday afternoon activity for any self-respecting gang of outlaws. In truth, it was one of the absolute rarest and stupidest crimes you could possibly attempt. Over a massive 40-year period across 15 Western states, historians have identified only about 10 to 15 genuine bank robberies. Banks were built like impenetrable fortresses and placed right in the dead center of town. Trying to ride away with heavy canvas bags full of silver coins while surrounded by dozens of heavily armed, angry local citizens was pure suicide. Outlaws weren't total idiots. They vastly preferred robbing isolated trains or stagecoaches in the middle of nowhere where the victims couldn't immediately shoot back at them. Myth 6. Dead or alive posters. We have all seen the classic vintage posters nailed to a wooden post, offering a massive pile of gold for an outlaw, wanted, dead or alive. It is a staple of the genre, but it is historically wildly inaccurate. First of all, the "or dead" clause was extremely rare, reserved only for the absolute most violent and legally unstoppable gangs. Second, the government didn't waste money printing these posters to nail on random street corners for oblivious farmers to read. They were almost exclusively published in local newspapers or mailed directly to professional lawmen, bounty hunters, and the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The idea of a random cowboy walking into a town, seeing a poster, and deciding to become a legendary bounty hunter over the weekend is pure Hollywood fiction. Myth 7. Absolute lawlessness. The term Wild West strongly implies a vast apocalyptic zone of absolute anarchy where murder was the primary method of communication. While remote, temporary mining camps full of drunken prospectors could indeed be incredibly violent, the established frontier towns were surprisingly civilized. Western society desperately wanted to attract wealthy Eastern investors and railroads, and rich people absolutely despise chaos. Because of this, towns quickly established official courts, hired judges, and built jails. In fact, historical crime records show that many established Western towns actually had significantly lower murder rates than the major, heavily populated, so-called civilized cities over on the East Coast of the United States during the exact same time period. Myth 8. Noble outlaws. Pop culture has spent decades turning characters like Jesse James and Billy the Kid into romantic, frontier versions of Robin Hood. The myth claims they were noble rebels fighting against corrupt railroad monopolies and giving their stolen loot back to poor, struggling farmers. The historical reality is incredibly ugly. They were violent, sociopathic thieves, racists, and murderers who robbed hard-working people purely to fund their own selfish greed. They didn't give a single dime to the poor. This incredibly persistent, romanticized image was entirely fabricated by dime novelists and sensationalist newspaper writers back east who needed thrilling, heroic stories to sell cheap paperbacks to bored city workers who had never actually stepped foot in the real, dangerous West. Myth 9. The honest sheriff. We inherently trust the man wearing the shiny silver star. We picture frontier lawmen as crystal-clean heroes possessing unshakable moral compasses, dedicating their lives to protecting the innocent. But the line separating a respected sheriff from a ruthless bandit was incredibly thin, and sometimes completely non-existent. Many legendary lawmen, including the famous Wyatt Earp, had extensive, highly documented criminal pasts. They frequently ran illegal gambling rings, owned heavily taxed brothels, and regularly worked on both sides of the law when it suited their personal bank accounts. Being a sheriff wasn't a noble calling. It was simply a highly profitable business position that allowed tough, violent men to legally eliminate their financial competition in town. Myth 10. The OK Corral. It is arguably the most legendary, heavily romanticized shootout in American history, representing the ultimate battle between law and order. The famous gunfight involving Wyatt Earp, his brothers, and Doc Holliday is globally known as the gunfight at the OK Corral. There is just one historically hilarious problem. It didn't actually happen in the corral. The incredibly brief, chaotic 30-second firefight actually took place in a narrow, empty dirt lot on Fremont Street, roughly 6 doors down from the corral's rear entrance. So, why the famous name? Because when the local journalists wrote the dramatic story for the newspapers, they simply realized that the gunfight at the OK Corral sounded vastly better than the gunfight in an empty dirt lot down the street.
Are we ruining your childhood yet? Good. You thought it was all honorable heroes and fair fights, but it was just terrible aim and strict gun control. Let's look at the glorious cowboys next. I hope you aren't wearing a Stetson because you're about to look ridiculous.
Myth 11. The cowboy hat. If you ask anyone to draw a cowboy, the very first thing they will sketch is a massive, wide-brimmed Stetson hat. It is the absolute defining symbol of the American West. But if you actually wore a giant Stetson on a windy, miserable cattle drive, you would spend half your day desperately chasing it across the muddy plains. The actual, historically accurate, and most popular hat worn by real frontier workers was the bowler hat, also known as the derby. It was inexpensive, it sat firmly and tightly on the head, and it absolutely refused to blow off when you were riding a horse in strong winds. The famous Stetson only became the mandatory cowboy uniform decades later, when Hollywood costume designers decided the bowler hat didn't look tough enough for the big movie screens. Myth 12. The white cowboy. When Hollywood decided to define the visual image of the American cowboy, they exclusively cast rugged white actors like John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. This created a massive, incredibly inaccurate historical whitewashing of the frontier. Historical reality was vastly more diverse and deeply interesting. Historians estimate that up to 1/3 of all working cowboys were African Americans, many of whom were freed slaves heading west after the Civil War because the frontier offered paid work and slightly less discrimination. Another massive portion of the workforce were Mexican vaqueros, who actually invented the very concept, tools, and riding styles of the cowboy. The true face of the American West looked absolutely nothing like a classic Hollywood movie casting call. Myth 13. The romantic cowboy life. Being a cowboy is constantly portrayed as a romantic, deeply spiritual adventure of freedom, sleeping under the brilliant stars and singing songs around a warm campfire. In reality, being a cowboy was the 19th century equivalent of working a terrible minimum-wage fast food job. It was grueling, filthy, mind-numbingly monotonous, and terribly low-paying seasonal labor. Cowboys spent up to 15 hours a day literally eating dust, staring at the back end of cows, and sleeping on the freezing, hard ground in the rain. Their diet consisted mostly of dry biscuits and cheap beans, and the physical toll on their bodies was absolutely devastating. There was no glorious romance on the trail, just incredibly hard manual labor performed by desperate men who needed a paycheck. Myth 14. Levi's blue jeans. Every modern cowboy wears a tough pair of blue denim jeans, so we naturally assume the cowboys of the 1880s did the exact same thing. But true, historical cowboys did not ride around wearing Levi's. When riveted Levi's jeans finally hit the market in 1873, they were designed strictly and exclusively for miners and gold prospectors who desperately needed tough pockets to hold heavy rocks without tearing. Cowboys actually hated them. True riders preferred wearing pants made of heavy wool or thick canvas. Wool kept them warm during freezing night rides and retained its heat even when completely soaked by pouring rain. Denim, on the other hand, offered absolutely zero insulation and was incredibly uncomfortable and cold when wet while sitting in a leather saddle all day long. Myth 15. Pointy cowboy boots. Those classic, sharp-pointed leather cowboy boots are an iconic piece of American fashion. We assume they were designed that way to help the cowboy easily slip his foot into the stirrup. But those extreme, pointy toes are a total historical myth. They only became popular in the 1940s, entirely driven by Hollywood costume designers who wanted their actors to look flashy and stylish on camera. In the 1800s, real cowboys simply wore standard, military-style cavalry boots with basic square or rounded toes. In fact, many boots during the early frontier days were manufactured on a straight last, which meant there was absolutely no difference between the left and the right boot. You simply forced them onto your feet until the heavy leather eventually molded to your shape in agony. Myth 16. Batwing doors. Every single Western movie features the tough hero dramatically pushing his way through those iconic, swinging batwing saloon doors before ordering a drink. It is a fantastic visual, but it makes absolutely no sense in most climates. While these swinging doors did exist in the blistering, suffocating heat of the deep Southwest for ventilation, the vast majority of frontier saloons had solid, normal, heavy wooden doors. The towns were constantly battered by freezing winter winds, massive blinding dust storms, and overwhelming swarms of insects. If a saloon owner installed half doors in a place like Montana or South Dakota, his customers would freeze to death while drinking. The batwing door is a Hollywood trope designed simply to let the camera see the action inside the bar. Myth 17. Saloon pianos. You expect to walk into any frontier saloon and instantly hear a cheerful man playing a lively, fast-paced tune on a slightly out-of-tune upright piano. It sets the perfect mood for a bar fight. However, a piano was an incredibly rare, extreme luxury item. Dragging a massive, incredibly heavy, delicate wooden instrument on a bouncing, springless wagon across thousands of miles of rough prairie was a complete logistical nightmare. Most early saloons were essentially just dirty tents or wooden shacks where the bar was literally a wooden plank resting on two empty whiskey barrels. Pianos were exclusively found in the wealthiest, most established high-end establishments of major cities, not in the dusty, temporary pop-up towns that define our image of the wild frontier. Myth 18. Warm beer and whiskey. When we picture the rugged cowboy ordering a drink, we assume he throws back a shot of harsh, burning whiskey or forces down a mug of disgusting, lukewarm beer. While whiskey was certainly popular, beer was actually the absolute favorite alcoholic drink of the West. And here is the biggest surprise. They didn't always drink it warm. Thanks to a massive, highly organized 19th century ice harvesting industry and the rapidly expanding railroad networks, many successful saloons actually built dedicated, insulated ice houses. They shipped massive blocks of frozen ice from the mountains and the north directly to the desert towns. Yes, the tough, rugged cowboys of the frontier actually enjoyed drinking their beer wonderfully ice cold, completely ruining the tough guy stereotype. Myth 19. Cheap frontier living. We naturally assume that moving out to the primitive frontier meant leaving behind the high costs of the modern city and living a cheap, simple life off the land. The truth is the exact opposite. In booming gold rush towns, the inflation was absolutely astronomical and terrifying. Because everything had to be transported across the continent, basic survival goods cost a fortune. A single apple, a clean shirt, or a simple iron shovel could cost the equivalent of hundreds of modern dollars. The people who actually got filthy rich during the gold rushes were almost never the desperate prospectors digging in the mud. It was the clever merchants, store owners, and saloon keepers who ruthlessly overcharged the miners for basic necessities required to stay alive. Myth 20. Women of the West. Movies strictly portray Western women in only two distinct roles. They are either helpless, crying damsels in distress waiting for a man to save them, or they are working upstairs in a dusty saloon. The historical truth is vastly more powerful and impressive. Women were the absolute backbone of frontier survival. They actively managed massive cattle ranches, legally owned property, and worked tirelessly as teachers, doctors, and business owners. The rugged, unforgiving frontier demanded total equality for survival, which is exactly why women in the Wild West gained the legal right to vote decades before the civilized East Coast. The territory of Wyoming proudly granted women full voting rights all the way back in 1869, proving the frontier was surprisingly progressive.
So, you'd be wearing a bowler hat, freezing in wool pants, and getting outsmarted by an apple merchant. Think you're still cut out for this? Pathetic. Now, let's completely destroy your favorite campfire stories about the epic journey west.
Myth 21. Cowboys versus Indians. The classic, timeless trope of cowboys locked in brutal, constant warfare with Native Americans is a complete Hollywood fabrication designed for cheap action scenes. In reality, Cowboys were just underpaid farmhands trying to herd incredibly stupid animals across the plains. They rarely crossed paths with native tribes, and when they did, they almost never fought them. They actually traded with them for safe passage. The brutal, tragic, and historically devastating wars against the Native American populations were fought almost entirely by the heavily armed, regular United States Army cavalry, not by random groups of guys holding lassos. Hollywood simply mashed two completely different historical groups together because it looked exciting on a movie theater screen. Myth 22. Wagon train attacks. Pioneer diaries and letters back home are filled with a deep, paralyzing fear of Native American attacks on their wagon trains. But the hard historical statistics tell a shockingly different story. Between the years 1840 and 1860, out of the roughly 400,000 pioneers who braved the treacherous Oregon Trail, fewer than 400 were actually killed in conflicts with natives. The real, absolute mass killers of the pioneers were entirely unglamorous. They died by the thousands from devastating cholera outbreaks, drowning in brutal river crossings, and, most embarrassingly, accidentally shooting themselves or their family members because they had absolutely no idea how to safely handle the firearms they bought for the journey. Disease was the true enemy, not arrows. Myth 23. The origin of scalping. Scalping is an incredibly brutal practice that pop culture has heavily, almost exclusively associated with Native American warriors. While the practice did technically exist among a few specific tribes prior to European contact, it was actually the European colonists who turned it into a massive, organized, and bloody commercial industry. Colonial governments, particularly the French and the British, created official, legal price lists and paid massive, life-changing bounties for native scalps. They literally turned a brutal act of war into a highly profitable, state-sponsored economic enterprise, encouraging mercenaries to hunt human beings for a paycheck. History often blames the victims for the exact atrocities that the conquerors industrialized and perfected. Myth 24. The Pony Express. The legendary Pony Express, with its incredibly brave young riders galloping at full speed to carry mail across the dangerous, wild frontier, feels like a massive, defining institution of the American West. It is celebrated in countless books and movies. In reality, the entire legendary service only existed for a pathetic 18 months, operating briefly from April 1860 to October 1861. As soon as the first transcontinental telegraph line was successfully completed, sending information instantly via electricity, the incredibly expensive and dangerous Pony Express immediately went bankrupt and disappeared from the world entirely. It was a massive financial failure that history later accidentally transformed into an enduring, romantic symbol of American determination. Myth 25. The Endless Era. The Wild West feels like a massive, sprawling era of history that must have lasted for centuries, shaping the deep cultural foundation of the entire country. But the classical, iconic frontier period was actually incredibly brief. It truly began right after the end of the American Civil War in 1865, when a broken nation started pushing westward, and it was officially declared over by the U.S. Census Bureau in the early 1890s. The entire legendary epic of the Wild West, the gunslingers, the massive cattle drives, the boom towns, lasted only about 30 years. It was a chaotic, incredibly short-lived flash in the pan that Hollywood later stretched, exaggerated, and milked for over a century of highly profitable entertainment and cultural propaganda. Myth 26. Conestoga Wagons. Every majestic painting and movie depicting the westward expansion features massive, boat-shaped, incredibly heavy Conestoga wagons carrying pioneer families. But those massive wooden beasts were designed specifically for flat, established eastern roads to haul heavy commercial freight. They were far too heavy and unwieldy to cross the treacherous, steep, rocky mountains. The real pioneers actually used much smaller, significantly lighter, and highly maneuverable wagons, known affectionately as prairie schooners. Even then, the wagons had absolutely no suspension. Riding inside one felt like being thrown in a wooden blender, so almost all the pioneers literally walked the entire 2,000 miles across the continent right next to their wagons. Myth 27. The desert heat. When we imagine the harsh conditions of the West, we picture a constant, grueling battle against the scorching, unforgiving sun and endless, dusty droughts. But the most devastating economic blow in frontier history didn't come from the heat. It came from the freezing cold. During the horrific winter of 1886 to 1887, historically known as the Great Die-Up, temperatures plummeted to -45 degrees Celsius. Blizzards buried the grass under feet of solid ice. Up to 90% of the cattle on the open ranges slowly froze or starved to death in a single apocalyptic winter. It completely wiped out massive fortunes overnight and forever forced the American beef industry to abandon the open range and start fencing in their animals to survive. Myth 28. The map of the West. When modern people say the words, the Wild West, they subconsciously imagine the entire United States existing in a state of primitive, dusty cowboy chaos. Historically, the term strictly applies only to the newly acquired territories west of the Mississippi River, stretching out toward the Pacific Ocean. During the exact same time period that cowboys were freezing in the mud, eating dry beans, and getting shot in dirt alleys, the East Coast of America was already a highly developed, incredibly modern, electrified industrial powerhouse. Cities like New York and Boston had massive factories, indoor plumbing, paved streets, and electric lights. The Wild West was just the raw, unrefined backyard of an already rapidly modernizing global superpower. Myth 29. The Custer Massacre. General George Custer's last stand at the Battle of the Little Bighorn is often painted as a heroic, agonizingly long, and epic defense against overwhelming odds, where brave soldiers fought to their very last breath. The historical reality is a story of absolute arrogance and devastating tactical stupidity. Custer, blinded by his own massive ego and desire for glory, completely ignored his scouts' warnings and marched his exhausted troops directly into a massive, heavily armed native encampment. It wasn't a long, heroic battle. It was an absolute slaughter. The combined Native American forces completely surrounded and annihilated Custer and his men in a matter of minutes, easily wiping out the arrogant commander who vastly underestimated his opponents. Myth 30. Who won the West? There is a famous saying that the West was won by the Colt revolver and the Winchester rifle, implying that rugged individual violence tamed the wild frontier. But history shows that the Wild West was actually killed and conquered by three incredibly boring, practical inventions. First, barbed wire, which completely destroyed the open range and ended the era of the cowboy by fencing off the land. Second, the Transcontinental Railroad, which brought massive corporate infrastructure, heavy industry, and millions of new settlers. And third, the telegraph, which brought instant communication and federal law enforcement to the most remote towns. The romantic, lawless frontier wasn't conquered by a lone gunslinger. It was systematically destroyed by corporate bureaucracy. The truth of history is rarely as neat, glamorous, or heroic as the movies want us to believe. The Wild West was not a land of cinematic heroes fighting for justice at high noon. It was a brutal, rapidly industrializing frontier built by exhausted laborers, clever businessmen, and desperate people simply trying to survive a freezing winter. But maybe the real history, the complex, messy, and diverse reality of how the frontier was actually settled, is a much more fascinating story than the sanitized myth Hollywood sold us for a century. So, you still want to buy a pair of pointy boots and ride off into the sunset? Be my guest. Drop a comment below and tell us which myth completely ruined your childhood the most. And hit that subscribe button unless you still believe in the Easter Bunny and fair gunfights. See you next time, partners.